Hello everyone, and today we're going to be talking once again to Dr Simon Peaple. This time on the First World War and how it was fought and paid for. The logistics of war and generally the sort of economic side to the First World War. So, let's go and see you there. Well, thank you for coming back on the programme.
Thank you for having me.
So, in 1918, Vladimir Lenin gave an explanation for the start of World War One, which I'm putting on the screen, and a link to the full quote, which, in brief, was the idea that capitalists were the main cause of the First World War, in that the lands of the world had been divided up, and so the only way that any more profit could be obtained was through fighting one another. So, and this became known as the Lenin Thesis. As a historian on the First World War, have you any thoughts regarding Lenin's thesis?
I think the first point that one would make is that Lenin was a Marxist and had spent an awful lot of time studying and writing about Marx. And therefore his understanding of history was very much coloured by that approach, where everything was down to socio-economic factors. And clearly in the context of 1918, when as the new head of Russia he got access to the secret treaties, the other materials that the Russian government had got, the reinsurance treaty with Germany, he could then see what it had promised or what it hadn't promised. Then he could see the new Russo-French agreement, he could see the secret clauses. So it was very possible for him to believe that if only the economic and social factors that he believed drove history had been looked at, then you could understand what happened. In fact, very difficult for Lenin if that wasn't the case. And then going on to the wider point, the economics of the First World War, the first thing that you could consider was this idea that competition had been exhausted. And certainly there is some support for that, in that if you look at the way in which the colonial powers had behaved before the First World War, they had indeed carved up large areas, the scramble for Africa being the most obvious, but in addition to that they had also carved up Asia, and so South America had trade agreements with virtually everybody, so therefore they weren't necessarily carved up in the same way, but there were colonies in South America and there was a lot of trade that was going on through long-standing agreements. So in one sense Lenin was correct, the markets of the world had been absorbed, particular countries had particular areas of foreign continents that they were leading in, their companies had the advantage in those areas. So if you went to East Africa you'd find some German manufactured screws, whereas if you went to a lot of southern or Western Africa, then they might be coming from Birmingham. So the odds are that that was a focus. And certainly if you look at the work about the Great Game beforehand, the High Asian areas, then the idea that Turkestan markets had Russian goods or British goods was part of the argument. And in the case of Persia, oil. So there was a lot there that could substantiate an economic thesis. The difficulty for saying that it's a key decision, decisive factor, is the decision makers, particularly in 1914, gave little thought to the economic side of life. And one has to remember that the people making those decisions were largely divorced from the economic community. In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm and his closest advisors might be related to people who had business interests, they might have family links. but they were not business people. So, you know, in 1913, when they were consulted sort of informally, those running Hamburg America line were saying, you know, well, no, we don't want war. You know, business will be very bad if we do that. So, you know, there was a certain sort of issue which said that they were not in any way being taken on board. And if you look at those key players, Bethmann Hollweg was a career politician, stroke administrator. You've got the Kaiser, who was totally uninvolved in business. You've got the general staff, who weren't involved in business and who had got their own theories. If you look across at Austria, there was a very strong gulf between those who were aristocratic and those who made money, although some Austrian nobles had relatives who were involved in commerce or banking. The reality was that the key people who made those decisions as to whether to go to war or not usually belonged to the officer corps or the court. If you then come to France, a little bit more mixed, but at the end of the day, Poincaré and Viviani were not people who were businessmen who had got into politics. They were people who were long-term politicians. Poincaré came from the Alsace region, so you know his attachment to Alsace-Lorraine was very strong, and there wasn't a great demand. In fact, you know, the big threat to the war in France came from organised labour. Jaurès was a key figure in the Internationale, the workers' groups that were trying to sort of improve the lives of workers across Europe, and they were very conscious of Lenin's other comment about the First World War. You know, there were many, but that particular one, which was that the war was being fought with rifles at which workers were at both ends, and the workers were very, very radicalised in France after 1911, and Jaurès was seen as a real threat that he might bring out the strike, particularly the railway strike. That would have completely broken the mobilisation plan, and the French were desperately worried that he would do that, and his assassination by a right-wing fanatic only underlines the point that the French were very nervous, but the people making the decisions were not the business people. People making the decisions were from the political class. And you know, to take one of the really obvious examples, if you look at Russia, you know, the Tsar had virtually no interaction with business per se. His key minister, the war minister Suvorov, was corrupt businessman, but only in the sense of he held concessions which allowed him to make money out of the armed forces, but he wasn't a business person per se, and he certainly wasn't making his decisions based around that. Sokomilov, similarly, part of the political elite. The army, led by the Tsar's relatives, not really going to challenge anyone from a business point of view. Russia had enormous economic potential. It didn't need a war. In fact, the war proved disastrous for its economic development. So from that point of view, Russia was going to war against its economic interests. And you know, there were many who would argue during the 1890s and into the 1900s that Russia needed peace. Russia needed a chance to gain stability so that its economy could begin to catch up with other countries. And lastly, Britain. You know, you've got Asquith, who's a prime minister, and he is a lawyer by training, middle class, not commercially orientated, although his wife, and therefore the person who was paying most of the money, came from trade, but not a business influence in that sense. Margot Tennant was from a big brewing family, but that didn't make them business people who had a stake in war or peace. It just was a business that carried on. So, therefore, they weren't directly involved. Lord Grey, I mean, old, landed, aristocratic family, favourite hobby, salmon fishing, still dwelling on the loss of his wife, had no focus on business. So to him, it was about the great powers, it was about how Britain was to maintain its place in the world. And that did not take any account of the economy or the business side of it.
So, if, as the business community was like either indifferent to there being a war or somewhat opposed to it, how did the great powers like fund their economies to go to war?
Well, the key issue is, of course, they didn't fund it. They did, you're quite right, in the sense that they found a way to do it, but they hadn't got the money. None of them. And, to start with, for example, the Germans had this idea that the war would be paid for the same way that the war against Austria and the war against France had been paid for, which was by indemnities and reparation payments. So when Germany beat the French in 1871, they insisted on reparations, and a huge amount of money had to be paid by the French to the Germans, and the French raised national loans to pay it off, encouraged their citizens to get their hard cash from under the mattress, in the typical portrayal of the French peasant sort of keeping his money tight and close, and persuaded them to take out bonds which would then pay the Germans off. So it was seen as very patriotic, and you were guaranteed your loan. The loan was a government loan, and that was going to pay for the war. So what the Germans learnt wrongly from the 1871 war was that you could pay for the war by getting them to pay you back afterwards. That worked in the sense of winning meant that you did get paid, but it was a short war, and the French paid up pretty quickly because they wanted to get free of the restrictions, and it was seen as a patriotic duty to do so. So they paid it back. And in fact, there was inflation in Germany as a result. In the 1870s, the government had said that half the money would go to local authorities. So the German Länder were receiving money, and obviously rather more money than usual. And so there's this huge outbreak in nice town halls being built, parks. It was very popular to lay out public parks with this money that was flowing through from the French. So they learnt the wrong lesson. They thought, oh, well, that's all right. What you do is you incur debt and then claim it all back off the loser. So first of all, you've got to win, and obviously in the First World War, the Germans didn't. But also, you've got to fund it in the meantime. And so what do? Now, the British were the most successful in doing the obvious thing, which was to raise taxation. So the British raised about 26% of what they needed through taxation, the highest percentage of any European country. So that worked insofar as the British raised taxes, but everybody else struggled. The Russians made the opposite error, an absolute cataclysmic error, in that they decided to ban alcohol for the duration of the war. Russian alcohol sales were controlled by the government. They were a huge source of revenue for the Russian government. By banning alcohol, they actually took away their single biggest revenue earner. Now, that was just crazy, and therefore led to real problems, compounded by the fact that, of course, illegal alcohol production then blossomed. So, everybody was taking their potatoes and distilling vodka from it, because why not? There was no tax, so you couldn't get the real stuff, and you just made your own. And in a country that was still 90% peasant, that was quite viable. And with a lot of factory workers actually being related to peasants because they'd left the land, they were the ones from the village who went off to the city and the rest stayed at home. The net result was there were good links. So, you might be a munitions worker in St. Petersburg, or renamed as Petrograd, or you might be working somewhere else. But your peasant relatives were still distilling alcohol on the premises and sending it to you. So, and there's a black market, as is always going to be the case. So you've got the Russians banning alcohol and denying themselves profit, which then massively undermines their economics, because having been struggling peacetime to make enough money to fund everything, they're suddenly faced with the wartime demands of it. And you're talking about having to create massive debt. The Russians borrowed from the Allies, the British and the French, were prepared to lend them money. And as we know, after the war, Lenin reneged on Russia's debts, and so these were only collected in 1993 for the debt owed to the First World War. Now, in some ways, by the time it arrived, it was a bonus, because the financial institutions still holding that debt had long since written it off. So it was probably an extraordinary profit. But for the short term, it was a very difficult situation. Now, if you then take the French, one of the reasons why reparations at the end of the war was so problematic was because the French needed the money. And where were they going to get it from? And the whole crisis of the Ruhr, where they occupied the Ruhr in 1923, came from the fact that here they were fighting to get reparations paid by the Germans. And the Germans were not as keen to pay as the French had been in the 1870s, because they felt that it wasn't their war, because there was a sense in which there was a clear victory in 1871. Part of the deal for the losers was to cough up. But in 1914, everybody persuaded everybody themselves that they were not starting the war. Now, there's a very strong argument that it was Austria and Germany that started the war, but they told their populations they only mobilised when the Russians were going to come screaming over the border, so people believed them, and that was fine. But it meant at the end of the war, reparations from the German point of view were crippling. I mean, absolutely, 62,000 million gold marks is just not payable. And it never was going to be payable. So it was bound to be negotiated back afterwards, and therefore was a problem. If you then look at Belgium was helped by the fact that the British decided to take over the Belgian debt. So Britain, at the end of the war, gave the Belgians the money they were supposed to get from the Germans, and Britain absorbed that and sort of provided for Belgium. Very brave, very noble of the British to do it in one sense, but quite foolish in another, because of course then the Germans owed them even more money, and that wasn't going to come as easily as they might have hoped. So that's another problem. But what about for Britain? Said that they were the most successful. Yeah, great. Quarter of the money, fine. But by the end of the war, they owed £11 for every pound they owed in 1914. How was that achieved? Firstly, like all the other countries, by war loans. People were persuaded that their patriotic duty was to buy war loans. And certainly in the 1920s, it was not uncommon for people to publicly give their war bonds to the government, that they would simply announce, I'm not asking for this money back, you can have it. Now, that gave governments a way forward. The Germans did it, French did it, British did it. War loans. Ask the people to subscribe to the war. So you're floating the war as a loan book. That worked in the sense that everybody borrowed against their own governments, who all promised to pay, and that they would get the money off the people on the other side when they lost. So, the Germans were going to have to pay if Britain and France and Russia won, the French, the British, and the Russians would pay if the Germans and Austrians won. So, you have an ability to raise debt, which is established, credit markets are already there. And then you have a new situation, a war, which is ongoing, which governments then borrow. So standard consolidated British debt increases. People might want higher interest rates because they can see there's going to be a lot of this debt, but nonetheless they accept that Britain is going to keep paying. And that is really the critical point. People accepted that these governments were not going to go bust. Now, in the case of Russia, that was a pretty big bit of faith. But if you go back in Britain's case, Britain had gone through the Napoleonic Wars. It had gone through major changes between the 17th and the 20th centuries. But one thing was consistent. They had always paid their debts. So apart from 1672, during the Anglo-Dutch War, when the Exchequer had said they couldn't pay debt, every year, constantly, the British government paid its debt. Now, it might be taking in £1 million of debt and rolling out £1 million of debt to pay for the million they've just paid back, but nonetheless, the belief was that the government would continue to pay. It managed it for nearly 300 years at the time, and therefore it would continue to do so. Now, that's the initial internal one. You persuade your population to cough up their money. So go to your people and say that. Now, that works, that's okay, but what about the serious amounts of money that must then be needed from somewhere else? And that comes, as we know, from America. America had the capital to invest in overseas assets. And ironically, the British and others had been busy investing in American assets, so new mills in America that would eventually put British mills out of work, or at least cut into their advantage. Britain had invested in banks, insurance companies, etc. What happened during World War I was that the British started buying American goods. And in 1915, which is in the first full year of the war, they were spending about $2 million a week. Now, it doesn't by modern day standards sound so much, but by that time's standards, that was a huge amount of money. So £2 million a week being spent on weapons in America. So people were investing in America, building up shares in these companies, supplying arms to the British and the French, and Britain was spending the money. Where does Britain continue to get dollars. Well, what they did was they asked British companies to liquidate their holdings in American companies and sell them the dollars earned at the official rate rather than the new market rate. So they were getting dollars based on the gold standard rate that had pertained in 1914, rather than at the less good rate, which now applied because there was a lot more demand for dollars and a lot less demand for the pound. And the gold standard was clearly suspended. So that's why they were able to get through and spend the money, because they were able to get the debt taken up, and there was a load of capital in America which enabled that to happen. Now, it doesn't mean it's just American capital, but America's loans to the Allies were a key part of why she ended up on the Allied side, but they were absolutely vital to keeping Britain, France, and through them Russia in the war.
So, when it comes to the American financiers, I know that kind of got into a bit of a conspiracy at various points in the 20th century, that American financiers and arms dealers were the ones who led the Europeans into war and were sort of like spread betting on the conflict. Is there much evidence that that the Wall Streeters were the ones sort of running the war behind the scenes?
I think it's fair to say that after the war it was very easy to blame politicians, to blame any group you liked, German brewers or whatever, for the conflict. The Wall Street element didn't drive the war. What drove the war was Wilson, first of all, wanting to get involved with the Allies. He believed in the Allied cause. He was strongly anti-German, and therefore he was going to lead America into war if he could. However, that wouldn't have been possible without the things like the war with Mexico triggered by the Zimmermann telegram. The decision to intercept the telegram and then to release it selectively was effective in persuading America that Germany would attack through Mexico, and therefore that Britain and France should be supported. The driver, the economic driver, was of course that by that point America could hardly afford the British and the French to fail. So it's easy to believe that that fact drove the policy. I think it'd be fairer to say that America still had an option of not joining the war. But Wilson's ideological dislike for Germany, the Zimmermann telegram as saying, we the Germans will back an invasion of the USA by Mexico, drove that point across. And then the thing that sort of, if you like, narrows the option is that you can't really join the German side, so who are you going to join, if you join at all? So you can hold back and hold back, but Wilson was an idealist, an internationalist. He wanted to influence the outcome of the war, and he realised that nobody who hadn't joined in was going to be listened to at the end. So if you wanted a seat at the table, you had to start somewhere. And Wilson understood that, and Wilson drove that into policy, which took America into the war. It didn't, I think this is quite critical, it didn't mean that the whole American involvement was inevitable based upon their industry. I think what it did was prove that if business is booming through supplying the Allies, if the president doesn't like the Germans, and if anything in Congress there's a more isolationist feeling, then not going into the war would still be a positive option, but the balance is changing because you can persuade Americans that for a relatively small contribution in material sense they could gain a huge advantage. But it's certainly not the case that Wall Street drove Wilson into the war, in my opinion.
So, just to round things off, what would be your thoughts on the fact that academia is somewhat moving away from the Lenin thesis nowadays towards more geopolitical explanations for the origins of World War One?
I think we've touched on it at the beginning, in that you should not write an explanation, an essay, a book about the First World War and why it started, and not have some idea of the economic pressures that were applying to the European powers. There was a decline in capital returns. There was a problem with the fact that if you wanted overseas possessions in order to create markets, they were largely gone. So Britain's economic position in 1914 was a lot less strong than it had looked 50 years earlier. But it would also be extremely difficult to prove that the only thing that made sure that the First World War started were economics, when you think that at the beginning I outlined how little economic influence was playing in the minds of those who made the key decisions. And I think it's really important to recognise that the First World War is a classic multi-causal event. If Campbell Bannerman hadn't died and Asquith hadn't then got the premiership, and the likes of Asquith, Lloyd George, had not had the dominant role in Parliament, in the government, then maybe we wouldn't have gone to war. Or if more honesty had been shown to the House of Commons from 1905 through to about 1908, and a greater understanding had been given to them of the balance of commitments being made. It's all very well Grey saying he never made a commitment to fight on the side of the French. But if you allow a conversation in which they move all their navy to the Mediterranean and you hold yours in the North Sea, then at the end of the day they cannot afford you to stay out of the war. So you kind of know, if the ultimatum's gone from one side and the response comes there, then somebody's going to start a fight, and you've lined yourself up with that statement to be on the side of the Allies. So it's inevitable, I think, that people have moved away from that thesis, because they've moved away from any one single thesis. You only have to take the inner politic debate. How much was it internal politics? Then you've got the foreign policy, the Weltpolitik angle. So if you've got internal pressures, external pressures, economic pressures, military pressures, all of those things come together, and to ignore any of them would be foolhardy. But to assume that any one of them answered all the questions would be equally rash. And that's why the Lenin Thesis is only going to be one paragraph in a classic four-page essay, because it can't offer all the answers.
thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to our furry friends for joining us too.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Really enjoyed it as always.
Thank you very much to Dr Peaple for joining us today. Hope you found this interesting. An interesting look at the economics of running a total war, as it were. And it was lovely having you here.